I'm going to go ahead and start the meeting. I'm John Forsyth. Retired from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering. I'm assisted today by Steve Harsh, who's Professor Emeritus of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics, and he chairs the steering committee of the Michigan State University Faculty Emeriti Association. Charles Gliozzo should be with us. He's Professor Emeritus of History and Director Emeritus of International Studies, and he arranged for today's speaker to be with us. We're also joined by Cindy Leverage, who's the Director of the Academic Leadership Development in the Office of Faculty and Academic Staff Development. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, David Firestein. David served in the Department of State for 19 years, specializing in U.S. China relations. He served as Senior Vice President and Parole Fellow at the New York City-based East-West Institute. He was a founding executive director of the University of Texas at Austin's China Public Policy Center and clinical professor at the UT's Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. He serves today as the inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, and he's a founding and current member of the foundation's board of directors. He's one of the few Americans who currently formally affiliated with two different U.S. presidential legacy entities, those being the Bush China Foundation and the LBJ School of Public Affairs at University of Texas. David Firestein has shared his insights on China with us several times, most recently just 2 months ago. With the recent statements of partnership by the presidents of China and Russia, followed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we asked him to comment on those issues. I'll turn the session over to David Firestein. Welcome again, David.
John, thank you so much. I really appreciate your kind introduction, and thanks so much to you and Stephen and Cindy, and of course, especially to my very dear friend, Chuck Gliozzo, who I see has joined us. It's always a pleasure to be with the MSU Faculty Emeriti Association and to take part in your speaker series. I just always greatly relish the time together and the opportunity to hear from you upon the conclusion of my remarks. And certainly we have a very rich topic today to delve into, and a very timely one. And I'm delighted and honored to be with all of you. Let me just say a little bit about my background, picking up on a couple of points that John mentioned, and then I'll get right into the subject at hand, which, as indicated on the screen, is China-Russia relations and the Russian invasion of Ukraine issues and prospects, and basically just a series of, I think, really interesting issues around this whole topic. So I was a U.S. diplomat, as John kindly noted in his introduction of me, and I worked on both U.S.-China relations and U.S.-Russia relations. I served for 5 years, a total of 5 years, at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, and I served for a total of 4 years at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and specialized heavily in both of those countries and both of those bilateral relationships. I should note more broadly that it reminds me of the phrase from the Cold War era, or the line from the Cold War era, where someone once said that the optimists were learning Russian and the pessimists were learning Chinese. I learned both. I don't know what that makes me, but I think it certainly is true that those two languages and those two countries are absolutely critical players in the world today, and we see them in the news an awful lot. So anyway, I'm just very glad to be able to address this topic. I want to go through about 6 different sort of subtopics and then leave plenty of time for questions, answers, discussion. There's no doubt that this topic, which all of us are so familiar with in terms of banner headlines virtually every day for the last 5 weeks, it's on our minds, it's on the minds of the nation and the world, and so we'll have a lot to discuss. But before that, I want to just talk a little bit briefly about the history of the China-Russia relationship. I won't go into depth, obviously, but I just want to lay out some backdrop and some context in order to kind of understand where that relationship is now and why it is where it is now. I want to talk in particular about the recent Putin Xi Jinping summit, which occurred in early February, basically right at the outset of the Winter Olympics, because that's a really important milestone in the relationship and one that's very germane to the issue of Ukraine. Then I want to say a little bit about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's response to that. And then I'll talk about the implications of all of this for the various bilateral relationships, the United States and the world, and then offer a few concluding thoughts. My hope is to go about an hour and maybe less, I hope a little less. But to be honest, this is the first time that I've ever given this talk. I just created the notes for this talk a little earlier today after having given quite a bit of reflection to it, to the subject matter. And so I will do my best to gauge the time, but I'm giving the talk for the first time, and I'm appreciative of the opportunity to do so. So let me start with a little bit of the history. I think the important thing to understand is that, and I want to just start with PRC-USSR relations. So therefore, starting on October 1st, 1949, when the People's Republic of China was founded. Obviously, the relationship between China and Russia more broadly goes back much further. But in the modern era, this is, I think, a reasonable starting point. And I think the main conceptual point or thematic point that I want to make is that the relationship between the People's Republic of China and the USSR got off to a fairly rocky start. Yes, both countries were major communist-led countries, communist nations, self-described. In many ways, both countries in 1949 and the early 1950s saw the world much the same way. But there was friction in the relationship from a very, very early date. And that friction developed into the 1950s and into the 1960s. There were ideological differences between the two countries. There was always a certain level of tension between the PRC and the USSR, in the sense that the USSR certainly regarded itself as the big brother of the two, and the one that could kind of boss around the little brother, the more established country, the country that was more powerful by certain metrics at that time, certainly. And the list goes on, and it resulted in a kind of feeling of inequality in the relationship that rubbed many Chinese the wrong way at the time, and even more so as time passed. In the 1960s, you actually saw significant differences around border issues, and even a skirmish that had the potential to become very significant. And at one point, even a threat on the part of the USSR to potentially use nuclear weapons relative to China in the context of those border disputes. So the relationship started off in a pretty rocky way and continued to be pretty rocky from the beginning, 1949, to into the late 1960s. And ultimately, it gave rise to China's desire, and for its part, the US desire, to engage each other, starting with the Kissinger and Nixon trips of the early 1970s, and then the rapprochement that occurred throughout the 1970s, ending with the normalization of U.S. China relations in 1979 under President Jimmy Carter. And both for the United States and for China, the notion of triangulating off of the USSR and, in a sense, coming together in some sense to kind of counter the USSR was something that was on the minds of both US and Chinese leaders at that time. And that ushered in the modern era of US China relations. One thing I want to point out, and I'm not going to dwell too much longer on the history, but I'm just trying to, again, provide a context for a lot of the other things that we'll discuss today. In the 1990s, I think there was a really interesting divergence in the pathways between what was now the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. On December 31st, 1991, the Soviet Union lowered its flag for the last time. On January 1st, 1992, a new country entered the world. It was called the Russian Federation, and under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin. And Russia began to embark on significant political reforms and to a certain degree, economic reforms and kind of the de-Sovietization, if you will, of the Russian economy. One of the themes that emerged in the 1990s between China and Russia, and for those looking at both countries, was the idea of should one liberalize politics first and then turn to the economy later, or should one liberalize the economy first and then potentially turn to politics later? Russia chose the former, to put it simply, and China chose the latter. And I remember having many conversations in China. I lived in China for a number of years during the 1990s. And I remember having many conversations with Chinese who felt very vindicated in the choices that their national leadership and that they as a nation made in terms of the emphasis on the economy rather than politics, as they looked at the Russian picture and saw political chaos, contested elections where even the U.S. had to weigh in to get, quote, the right result, as we did in 1996 when Boris Yeltsin was under a real threat of being defeated by Gennady Zyuganov, the leader of the Communist Party, in a free and fair election in 1996. Meanwhile, the chaos of the Russian economy, the privatization, the crony capitalism, China looked at Russia and essentially felt very vindicated in having made the decisions that it made. But the two countries were in many ways on very different paths. China was very focused on the economy, very focused at that time on the notion of integrating with the global economy, working with the United States and many others to negotiate terms of accession to the World Trade Organization, which China joined formally in 2001. And it was really focused on kind of getting integrated with the global economy in a way that Russia was evidently not. So there was a fork in the road there. I just want to mention a couple of other points before turning to the Putin Xi Summit of February of this year, about 6-7 weeks ago. And that is in 2001, the 9/11 attacks occurred. And for a brief moment, for about 2 years, really about a year and a half, in many ways, the civilized world was united around the notion of fighting terrorism and fighting terrorists and fighting the people who had perpetrated this horrific attack on the United States and really on, in some ways, civilization itself. And Russia and China were among the first countries to express condolences to the United States immediately after 9/11, and were among the very first countries to condemn these dastardly attacks on the United States and to join forces, along with many other countries, with the United States in seeking to defeat the scourge of terrorism starting in 2001. That, however, unraveled when the United States made the decision to go into Iraq in 2003. And at that point, I think that's an important moment as we talk about the United States, China, and Russia, and also the China-Russia relationship per se, because that was the moment where I think we started to see very clearly that in terms of votes in the United Nations around the question of Iraq, for example, where Russia, China, along with France and Germany, and who were NATO allies and others, voted against the United States in terms of the issue of Iraq. And what we started to see is that fundamentally there was, and there remains, a major tension point doctrinally between the United States on the one hand and Russia and China respectively on the other. And that is the notion that the United States seeks to maintain unipolarity and to be the sole superpower in the world. We state that as a matter of doctrine. We literally put that in writing in our national security strategy. We're not apologetic about it. We lay it out very clearly. And I think what we started to see very, very sharply starting in 2003, and the roots of it were there long before that, but starting in 2003 with the U.S. action in Iraq, what we started to see was a very clear-cut divergence between the notion of U.S. unipolarity on the one hand and those who were comfortable with that on the one hand versus the notion of multipolarity or polycentric type of global order, which is something that China, Russia, and a number of other countries started to express a great deal of affinity for, and that became their doctrine. So I think 2003 is really the beginning, as I see it, of the period where, notwithstanding the earlier tensions in the relationship between China and Russia, the ones that I mentioned at the outset, Russia and China started to realize that in many ways their worldview was more similar than dissimilar at this point, and they started to come together in ways that were different than what we had seen in the decades prior to that. So from 2003 to 2022, we have seen, I think, a steady and significant growth or a growth trajectory in the relationship between China and Russia. And we've seen that as measured by the amount of trade. Back about 20 years ago, China-Russia trade was kind of stagnating at around 15 or 20 billion or maybe $25 billion a year in two-way trade, these are very negligible figures in the context of global trade. Today, it's more like 150 billion, just to put that in perspective. So it's grown about sixfold in the last 20 years. And by other metrics as well, the relationship has really started to blossom, I think largely rooted in or anchored in this notion that China and Russia both see themselves as seeing the world differently than the United States does, and they see themselves as potential partners when it comes to certain sets of global challenges and global issues where they have one take and the US and many of our allies have a different take. And now we see the manifestation of that sense of commonality of purpose, if you will, with a relationship between China and Russia that has really blossomed. That leads me to the next point that I want to make, which is the topic of the Putin Xi Summit that occurred in early February, right as the Winter Olympics were beginning in Beijing. And Putin was in Beijing. He was one of the major national leaders to be present at the opening ceremony. And some of us who watched the Olympics and the opening ceremony may remember those somewhat awkward scenes of the social distancing that had to take place pursuant to China's COVID-19 policies. And so there were images of Putin sitting there, and you couldn't see anyone around him for about 10 seats or so. But he was there in a place of honor. And of course, he had met with Xi Jinping, and they spent a lot of time together and developed a lengthy joint communique, if you will, or a joint press statement. I think it was some 5,400 words. And it basically laid out a kind of joint vision between China and Russia as to the nature of this relationship and where it was going. One could say a lot about that statement, but I think in kind of headline terms, the basic idea that was in fact the main headline in the press for the most part coming out of the Putin Xi Summit was the idea, and it was a phrase taken from the statement itself, that the relationship, or the exact words were, the friendship between China and Russia has, quote, no limits, unquote, no limits. That was the exact phrase. And that there are no, quote, forbidden areas, unquote, in China-Russia collaboration. And so that represented to me, and I think to many observers of this bilateral relationship, a symbolic but significant step in kind of raising the bar for the China-Russia relationship and getting it, at least rhetorically and arguably in terms of tonality and even substance, to a qualitatively different level than it had been for even the previous 2 decades, let alone the decades before that. So this notion of a no limits friendship and no forbidden areas in terms of collaboration, the notion of laying out a vision of what they referred to in the document as a, quote, polycentric world in which China is one center, Russia is one center, presumably Europe another, Japan and others, other centers, and of course the US as well. But this notion of polycentrism or multipolarity, it was an important theme in the document, and there were many others. Also notably, although it wasn't big news per se, but notably Russia stated in the statement that it strongly supported China's position in terms of what China refers to as the one China principle, which is the idea that Taiwan is a part of China and an inalienable part of China, And more cryptically, China referred later in the document to the notion of supporting and endorsing Russia's security aspirations. And that was viewed as a kind of a cryptic reference, at least in retrospect, and arguably even at the time, to the issue of Ukraine, though the word Ukraine did not appear in this long document. So there was very much a meeting of the minds and a sense of commonality of purpose. And I would say that at the end of that summit, it would not be unfair to say that the China-Russia relationship had now reached a height that it had never reached subsequent to 1949. And I don't think that would be an exaggeration in terms of either the substance or perhaps more immediately to the point, the tonality and the symbolism and the language that these two leaders were using. One parenthetical point that I think is worth noting, both Putin and Xi have each referred to the other as his, quote, best friend. So Xi has referred to Putin as his best friend, unquote, and Putin has referred to Xi Jinping as his best friend, unquote, unquote. And so there is it's striking to hear that type of language, very close, a kind of emotional language between two world leaders. And certainly it's striking to see that type of language and that type of metaphor being used by these two leaders, the leaders of China and Russia. So there is a close relationship there. Now, this leads to February 24th. February 24th, just scarcely a month ago, the date on which Russia invaded the sovereign nation of Ukraine in a naked act of flagrant aggression and a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter, and an obvious and flagrant violation of another nation's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And Russia literally rolled tanks, I believe at 4 a.m., into the sovereign nation of Ukraine and began bombarding it and so forth and so on. And we've all seen that play out over the last 5 weeks. And so let me say a little bit here about Russia's goals, about the timing, about what's happened. I won't go into kind of the details of the military aspect of the conflict because all of us have seen this play out on television every day. And we're all very cognizant that Russia is attacking from the east, the north, the south, and it's even doing missile strikes in the west. It's essentially an all fronts, full-fledged assault on the nation of Ukraine, including civilian targets and so forth and so on. And I won't go into all of that because I think that's playing out in real time on our television screens. But let me say a little bit about some of the thematic elements of this to set the backdrop for talking about China's reaction and what that means for the U.S., for the world, and then a few concluding thoughts. So I think the first question that certainly I've been thinking about, and many people in the world have been thinking about, is why did Russia do this? Why did Russia go into Ukraine? And in a minute, I'll come to a related question. Why did Russia go into Ukraine at this particular time? To be honest, I think you can ask a lot of very serious experts on Russia-Ukraine relations, Ukraine, NATO. You can get any expert you want, and you'll get a number of different answers to this question because in some ways, there's not one obvious answer. But let me reel off some of the things that I think certainly have some explanatory value. Number one, Russia certainly has stated many times that it is concerned about, and it has been and is and remains concerned about the notion of the expansion eastward of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, or NATO, which of course expanded eastward starting with the end of the Cold War and became a treaty alliance of, I think now 30 countries. It's 29 or 30, I think it may be 30, which include the original 16, but also another 13 or 14 from essentially the Warsaw Pact countries, the former Warsaw Pact countries, and even the Baltic states on Russia's perimeter. And so Russia has said publicly many, many times over the years that it has had grave and existential concerns about the expansion of NATO and the notion or the prospect that Ukraine might join NATO. And so, in order to prevent that, Russia has gone into Ukraine and essentially made it impossible for Ukraine to ever join NATO by virtue of the fact that the stakes have been raised because Russia is now essentially occupying Ukraine and has made it very clear it is willing to literally to fight a war over this issue. And in fact, that's at least what it says that it's doing now. It claims to be fighting over this issue, among others. That's one issue, the issue of NATO, the issue of NATO's eastward expansion. The second issue, I think unrelated to that, and almost, I would say, bizarrely and really outlandishly, Vladimir Putin and other Russian officials have stated that they seek to, quote, denazify, that is to say, remove Nazi influence from the government and leadership of Ukraine, something that is just a head scratcher at so many different levels, not least because the president of Ukraine is Jewish and lost relatives in the Holocaust. And the notion that somehow there's Nazi influence in that regime is absolutely ludicrous and just kind of bizarre. But that seems to be one of the stated motivations or reasons that Russia has gone into Ukraine, again, as articulated by Vladimir Putin and others. The notion of creating a kind of geographic buffer out of Ukraine as a kind of bulwark against Poland and the other countries to the west of Ukraine that are in NATO. That notion, the old school kind of World War II era notion or 20th century era notion of creating a physical land buffer, a geographic buffer, or strategic depth, as it's sometimes referred to. That idea is often put out there as one of the reasons why Russia is trying to neutralize or Finlandize Ukraine, that you don't want the enemy right on your borders. You want to have some depth there, some cushion, if you will. So that argument has been put forward. And I think most fundamentally, one of the things that we hear from Russia and from Vladimir Putin in particular is the idea that Ukraine was really never a real country. Again, I'm stating it in the way that Vladimir Putin has stated it. This is what he's said. He said that he didn't think that Ukraine was ever a real country, that it was essentially an artificial construct that was artificially created and that doesn't really by rights have the right to exist as a self-standing country, but that in fact Ukraine really has always been a part of Russia, and that Ukraine is really the cradle of Russian civilization per se, and Kiev in particular is the kind of cradle of much of what Russia regards as Russian civilization or even Russian food in many cases. And as a result, Ukraine really rightfully belongs to Russia. And there is a kind of psychic attachment or psychological attachment that Vladimir Putin seems to feel, and I think other Russians to one degree or another seem to feel. Many, many Russians, by the way, have very close blood relatives in Ukraine. No question about that. I saw that firsthand when I lived in Russia for 4 years, and most of the people I knew had close relatives in Russia who were Russians, had close relatives living in Ukraine, aunts, uncles, cousins, brothers, sisters, and many others. And so this notion that Ukraine really is rightly a part of Russia, I think, is very much at the core of Vladimir Putin's thinking. And so I think these are the kinds of reasons that have been at various points put forward by President Putin and by others as kind of rationales or justifications for why Russia has gone into Ukraine. I think a harder question to answer is, why did this occur now? Why on February 24th? Why not February 23rd? Why not February 25th? Why not 3 years ago or 7 years ago? Why not 4 years from today? Why did this happen at this particular time? And to be honest with you, I haven't yet encountered a Russia expert that has any more of a sense for that in definitive terms than I do, because I kind of scratch my head as well. What was it about this moment at this time that made it seem like this was the right thing to do? Now, that being said, we can offer some conjecture. I think at one level, there are a few different data points, and we can perhaps add them together to come up with some type of a thesis, or speculation as to why now. Vladimir Putin had been in China. He had had a summit with Xi Jinping. I think we can presume that that was probably important to President Putin to have that meeting behind him. Maybe he felt that he got a kind of reassurance from China that this would be something that China would be supportive of. China rejects the idea that that was discussed. They do not accept that. They do not accept characterizations that China knew in advance what Russia was going to do. But perhaps Putin came away from that meeting with that sense, and therefore waiting until that summit had occurred was one of the reasons why this occurred not long after the summit. That may be part of the timing. Getting past the Olympics, I think, clearly was another consideration. Just in general, it's not a good look to be at war during the Olympics. That's happened before in terms of Russia's invasion of Georgia in the summer of 2008. And I think probably getting past the Olympics was another consideration. I have speculated, I haven't heard others make this particular point, maybe others have, maybe they haven't, but I've speculated that this was not going to happen during the presidency of Donald Trump. And therefore, it didn't happen in the last 4 years, even if Russia was thinking in these terms. Perhaps because Putin had an affinity for Trump, and Trump seemingly certainly had an affinity for Putin. And there was a warmth there very clearly between the two men, the two leaders. And probably, this is just my speculation at a very lay level, but probably Putin would not have wanted to embarrass his friend by doing this on his watch. And that leads to the converse, which is now that Biden is president and has been for 1 year. I think in retrospect, as we look back at the motivation for this timing, perhaps one of the considerations on the part of Vladimir Putin was to give a black eye to Joe Biden in the run up to the 2022 midterm elections this November, and perhaps even lend some impetus to a Donald Trump candidacy for president in 2024. That's pure speculation, but judging from the content that was generated from the impeachment around the topic of Ukraine, the first of the two impeachments, it's not an implausible theory, given the interactions that we've seen that are on the record between Trump and Putin, and between Trump and the leadership of Ukraine. So, there could be literally political motivations to this as well. I don't know for sure, but the timing is interesting. And as we look at it from where we are now, I find myself wondering if some of these types of considerations drove the timing. Let me say a few words before turning to the Chinese reaction to this and the China angle of the U.S. Of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Just a couple of points about what the United States, NATO, and the West have done in response. I won't belabor it. I think everyone is very well aware that the United States and its NATO allies, along with the European Union, many of whom are NATO allies and others within the European Union are not, that many of these nations have come together, scores of nations have come together, mostly Western European, the U.S., North American, and others, and levied really punishing sanctions on Vladimir Putin, other significant figures in the Kremlin and the Russian leadership, and the Russian government as a whole, and indeed the Russian economy as a whole, and have really reacted in a way that is extremely united, cohesive, and focused. And I think certainly the leaders of the United States, NATO, the Western countries, the EU countries, and others involved would say in a way that is proportionate to Russia's actions. I mean, one thing that was clear right at the outset from President Biden himself, he made it absolutely clear right at the beginning, the United States was not going to fight Russia in a hot war over this issue, period. He made it very clear, and he's held that line thus far very consistently. And I think that sentiment is probably a sentiment shared by most of the other, really all of the other allies and partners in this. No one seems to want to fight among the governments, among the leaders, not talking about public opinion generally. None of the leaders seem to want to fight what would be regarded as potentially World War III and potentially a nuclear conflict over this particular issue. That being said, there has been a very focused response, and really a line has been drawn in the sand. And to use a phrase from yesteryear, you're either with us or you're against us, I think is kind of the mindset of the United States, the NATO allies, the European Union partners, and others. And scores and scores of powerful nations are on that side of the issue. That being said, it leads me to the topic of China, and that is a very interesting part of the story. China is one of the very, very few major nations in the world, Western or non-Western, that has very specifically refused to condemn Russia's naked and absolutely illegal and horrible aggression against Ukraine. It simply hasn't done it. It has not condemned Russia's aggression. Even today, as we sit here in these 5 weeks, it has never offered a condemnatory statement. And in fact, when the United Nations voted on basically to condemn Russia's aggression against another United Nations member state, namely Ukraine, China was one of a number of countries, I think it was 21 or so, who abstained. They didn't vote yes or no. They just abstained, as they almost always do on these kinds of matters. And by the way, as a parenthetical point, voting with Russia were a total of just 4 countries, namely Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, and one other, and Syria. Syria was the 4th. And so those were the countries that voted with Russia. 120 some countries voted against Russia, and then about 20 abstained. So, Russia became very isolated. China, which had just rolled out this incredible new partnership with Russia, literally on February 4th, with that joint statement and with all the trappings of the Russia-China summit, the Putin Xi Summit that we talked about earlier, having just stood literally with Putin and talked about a no limits friendship, all of a sudden is in a position where it's got Russia invading its foreign neighbor, its next door neighbor, Ukraine. So, immediately China has kind of tried to, from the very beginning, from the first hours, it has tried to stake out a position of, quote, neutrality. But I think for reasons that I'll elaborate on here in the next couple of minutes, it would be more correct to look at China's so-called, quote, neutrality, unquote, more as a, quote, friendly neutrality toward Russia. It is neutral in some sense, in the sense that China has not said this is a great thing. It didn't vote with Russia, but it has also not said this is a horrible thing and it didn't vote against, etc. However, the reason I say it is a friendly neutrality toward Russia is because China, in its public statements, its official statements, from the Chinese leadership, the foreign ministry, the foreign minister himself, other significant figures, China has stated that it accepts the logic and the rationale of Russia in terms of rationale that Russia has laid out as justifying its action relative to Ukraine, that China accepts that argumentation as legitimate. Namely, China has said that it agrees with Russia that this whole thing, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is actually not Russia's fault. It's actually the West's fault and NATO's fault, and in particular, the United States' fault, because after all, the United States, which is the leader of NATO, as we all know, and NATO itself, brazenly, in this view, expanded eastward the 1990s and the 2000s, the aughts, and so on. And therefore, that is the underlying reason for the situation being where it is today. In embracing that Russian talking point, China has shown that it is not really neutral per se. It is really essentially embracing the Russian argumentation, even as it is seeking to straddle the issue, even as it is seeking to give some humanitarian aid, which it has done to Ukraine. And even as it says, as it has said recently, it said early on that it didn't, that it regarded the Russia-Ukraine conflict as, quote, something it didn't want to see, something it did not want to see. And then more emphatically, I just heard the Chinese ambassador on, I think it was a PBS interview, Frontline or Face the Nation, I think, in which he said that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was, he didn't use the word invasion, but the Russian action in Ukraine was, quote, a mistake. I believe I heard the ambassador use that word recently, about a week ago. So China is trying to play it a lot of different ways, get on both sides of it. And fundamentally, what it represents is that China is trying to juggle two policy imperatives at the same time, or what it regards as policy imperatives. Number one, China wants to keep the momentum of this burgeoning partnership with Russia going in the right direction as it sees it. In other words, it wants to sustain the momentum of this kind of love fest or bromance, as some have called it, between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and between the two nations. And it wants to keep that positive momentum going and not sort of cut anchor and let Russia go. But at the same time, China has long articulated a commitment to the principles, which I think it's generally been very consistent in adhering to in terms of any foreign nation, as it defines the term foreign nation. The notion of the inviolability of sovereignty and territorial integrity, which are two of what China refers to as its five principles of peaceful coexistence. But the notion that one UN member state should respect the sovereignty of another UN member state is something China has always been in favor of. The notion that one UN member state should respect the territorial integrity of another UN member state is an idea that China has always supported. The idea of non-interference in the internal affairs of another state is another idea that China embraces. And yet, self-evidently, Russia has absolutely blown to smithereens all of these concepts in its action in terms of Ukraine. And for China not to call that out places China in a very awkward position, a position that is absolutely inconsistent with its stated principles and stated procedural values when it comes to how the world should operate. So China is in this very difficult, diplomatically awkward position. And this kind of groping for a defensible position in terms of Ukraine reflects that awkwardness and has put China in a fairly tenuous position and arguably an untenable position diplomatically over the long run. One thing that has been a significant headline over the last week or 10 days is the idea that the United States has said publicly and privately, in the person of President Biden, but also in the person of the National Security Advisor and other senior officials like the Secretary of State and others, that China would be very badly served if it were to lend either military or economic assistance to Russia for the purpose of aiding Russia's military efforts in Ukraine or blunting the impact of Western sanctions on the Russian economy. And President Biden, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, and others have said, you don't want to do this, China, because if you go down that road, we will punish you for it just as severely as we've punished China for, as we've punished Russia for doing what it has done in Ukraine. And it's a pretty tough message. It's been delivered in pretty tough tonal terms. But it is certainly where the U.S. is on the issue. And it puts China at a position where there is a fundamental choice point in front of it. And that's one of the things I want to talk about as we talk about implications and kind of reverberations of the whole Ukraine situation in terms of U.S. China relations, China's future, and a number of other things. One thing I want to do before I go into that kind of penultimate topic, and I'm looking at the clock and I'll wind up here fairly shortly. But one of the things that I want to say is that there is apparently some disagreement within Chinese policy circles, academic think tank circles, as to where China is on the issue of Ukraine. It is true that the leadership declares itself to be neutral, but in fact tilts toward Russia in very obvious ways. That's self-evident and indisputable. But under the surface, it is also clear, and I've seen this in some of the conversations that I've been a part of, that a lot of very thoughtful Chinese, frankly, feel that China is on the wrong side of this issue. And by the way, I think that China is on the wrong side of this issue, no question about it. This is a moment for moral clarity. This is an easy one. You have Russia literally rolling tanks into a sovereign nation for no reason and killing thousands of infants and children and women and men and civilians and blowing up apartment buildings and maternity wards. If this isn't an easy issue to get on the right side of, I don't know what is. And I think China is absolutely on the wrong side of this issue. And by the way, the Bush-China Foundation has said that publicly. And we've urged China to condemn Russia's naked aggression against Ukraine. That being said, there is a significant voice collectively in China that basically makes that same point and basically says, we're on the wrong side of this issue, and it is in our interest, that is to say, it is in the interest of the People's Republic of China to get on the right side of this issue quickly, because this is a major moment for this country, for China. And I think people in China see this for the kind of inflection point that it is. Let me say a few words about, as I wrap up here, I'll try to end by the half-hour mark here at 2:30 Central, 3:30 Eastern Time, if not even a couple of minutes before that, so that we can use the remaining half hour after that for questions and discussion. But let me talk a little bit about the implications of all of this for China-Russia, for the U.S.-China relationship, and so forth. So I'll just kind of share a few bullet points, if you will. Number one, implications for China-Russia. I think that, to put it simply, China is feeling a certain sense of buyer's remorse. This is just my opinion, my analysis, but I think many would agree that China thought it was getting one thing when it entered into this so-called no limits partnership with Russia. And now, in some ways, I think probably was blindsided by this and is being forced into an extremely awkward and difficult position for China. And I think it's more than what China bargained for. And I think that this entire episode is going to end up causing significant damage to the China-Russia relationship. We don't see that playing out publicly yet, but I just have a hunch that there are some folks in China that are very upset with what Russia has done, not necessarily because they care about what's happening in Ukraine, but because, and they may or may not, but because of the difficulty that this presents to China from a policy standpoint and the bind that it puts China in. And I don't think China appreciates that kind of thing. So net, I think we're going to see a negative hit to the China-Russia relationship, which had reached an all-time rhetorical high just as recently as February 4th, and in the immediate afterglow of that. In terms of U.S.-China relations, I think we are really at an inflection point. I think China fundamentally faces a very profound choice. Either it gets with the program as stated, from a U.S. perspective, and joins the United States and most of the rest of the civilized world, the world that has come out and said that this aggression is wrong and seen this as a moment of moral clarity. And either China gets with this group of scores and scores of powerful nations, or it chooses to side with Russia and cast its lot with Russia. And depending on or arguably, sort of stay neutral or stay in the kind of current position, which in a sense would be tantamount to, in the eyes of the United States and many others, almost throwing its lot in with Russia, in as much as China is embracing Russia's narrative about the justification for this action and so on. There is a real choice point there for China, and I think China has to think long and hard about what it wants to do for itself, but the implications of that for U.S.-China relations are going to be profound. If China decides ultimately to literally throw its lot in with Russia and just say, it's us against the world, then quite candidly, China will essentially become a Cold War adversary of the United States in a kind of fully official sense. I mean, there's no question that the United States government and US Congress and many others in this country have come to view China as an adversary and as an enemy of our nation. That being said, we still trade nearly $1 trillion, the better part of $1 trillion a year in two-way trade. There's still a lot of engagement between the two countries and so on. But if China casts its lot with Russia, that will change in a very fundamental and radical way. And the implications would be profound for the world and for both countries and everyone else in it. What are the implications for Taiwan? This is a question that comes up a lot. Just in short, the notion that Russia's gone into Ukraine. No one is challenging Russia other than Ukraine itself, of course. Militarily, NATO has not gone in fact, has stated that it will not go in and fight a hot war in Ukraine with NATO troops, although we are supplying Ukraine with arms and so on, but we're not going to fight that war, according to President Biden and the other NATO leaders. Therefore, what does this mean for China? Well, does this mean that China looks at this and sees that it could possibly get away, quote unquote, with taking over Taiwan militarily? And does this create an impetus for China to go into Taiwan and kind of do to Taiwan what Russia's doing to Ukraine? That's a question that has been put out there by many observers. In short, just the short version, I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think anything that has happened in Ukraine fundamentally changes the cost benefit analysis of China as it looks at Taiwan scenarios. As I often say, every day that the Chinese leadership wakes up in the morning and doesn't invade Taiwan is a day that China's leadership, in my judgment, appears to conclude that the costs of doing so outweigh the benefits. Because I think if they believed that the benefits of doing so outweighed the costs, they would do it. And so definitionally, I think it means that they believe the costs are prohibitive. And I don't think anything that's happened in Ukraine thus far changes that calculus. And if anything, I think what China sees is what certainly I saw and would have predicted in this scenario, and that is that you will see a huge degree of world cohesion and unity in response to any type of overture of that nature. That's what we're seeing with respect to Russia. We're not seeing a hot war between Russia and the United States or Russia and NATO, but we are seeing an absolutely cohesive and unified response. There's no question that China would get at least that response, if not an even more emphatic response in terms of sanctions and so on. And I think China understands that. So I've posed the question. The question's been posed by many observers about the implications for Taiwan. Having posed it, I don't think we're going to see anytime in the foreseeable future a Chinese action against Taiwan for the reasons that I've mentioned. What are the implications of all of this for the global economy? I think in short, we are looking at the possibility of the global economy truly bifurcating into two camps, much as the Cold War economy, the global economy during the Cold War period from 1945 to 1991, much as we saw during that period, there were essentially two economies. They were not particularly linked. One was, the West and the market economies of the world, and the other was the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact and the non-market economies. And those two groupings of economies did not interact to a very significant degree. We could see, as a result of Russia's choices and depending on what China does, a bifurcation of the global economy into the West and the rest, or the West on the one side, Russia on the other. And if China sides with Russia, then that's a significant block on the other side. If China doesn't side with Russia and realizes that its economic future is far more tethered to the United States and Europe, then Russia will be very isolated. And you'll see that bifurcation, but that bifurcation will be less consequential because Russia, while not an insignificant economy in the world, approximately 10th largest in the world, is also not one of the top 5 economies. And by itself, it's not going to move the needle of the global economy all that much. So there's a real kind of inflection point or fulcrum there that will depend in significant measure on what China decides to do as all of these issues get sorted out. One profound implication of all of this is the notion that I think as of February 24th, the day that Russia went into Ukraine, in an absolutely unprovoked, unjustified, and just flagrant violation of the UN Charter and all international laws and norms that govern these matters. On that day, in my judgment, Cold War 2.0 started, period. We are now in a full-fledged Cold War with Russia. I don't think we were on February 23rd. And one could argue that one way or the other. I don't think we were on February 23rd. I think when they rolled tanks into Ukraine, we now are literally back in the Cold War. And I think the choice point that China faces is, do they want to enter the Cold War on Russia's side or on the Western side, or somehow try to straddle it and stay neutral? And what China decides in that regard is going to have far-reaching implications for the world, to put it mildly. But from a standpoint of Russia, I think we now see clearly a total rupture in the relationship between Russia and the United States, between Russia and the West. And we now see a literal Cold War footing, complete with proxy wars, which we now see in Ukraine. Literally, Russia's fighting on one side. We're, in a sense, fighting on the other side indirectly through the provision of armaments. And this is 1960s and 1970s era stuff. So I think we can now declare that the Cold War is back. And the central question of our time is, which side of that Cold War will China join, if either? Another implication, just as I wrap up here, the cohesiveness of NATO, the cohesiveness of the NATO plus EU plus Europe plus civilized world response. There are a lot of people that say somehow they were surprised by how cohesive the response was. Maybe I'm just uninformed, but I wasn't surprised at all. I lived in Russia. I worked on NATO issues in that context for a long time. I think NATO is actually a very cohesive entity, and it has been for some time when it comes to things like this. And I actually wasn't surprised at all that NATO and the United States and all the players on this side of the issue came together in very quickly and in the way they did to do everything short of engaging in military conflict to respond to this egregious and outrageous violation of international law that Russia has perpetrated. So one of the implications of all of this is that I think we have certainly a new, a refreshed and reconsecrated sense of cohesion and unity of purpose and commonality of purpose amongst NATO. I never really doubted it was there, but a lot of people seem to doubt that it was there. And I think for those people, we now see that all of that has been refreshed. And I think the last couple of points I would make before concluding is just to say that, one point that I think I haven't heard anyone else make, but that I've made in a couple of talks that I've given is that, the notion that Russia had something to fear from NATO, I think is absolutely and emphatically and really irrefutably belied by the fact that even with Russia going into Ukraine, and the fact that NATO has done nothing about it in terms of fighting Russia, it has literally not committed a single troop to fight Russia and undo this aggression. That fact alone belies the very concept that Russia has put forward, that NATO is a threat to Russia. If NATO were a threat to Russia, Russia would be in smoldering ruins right now, having done what it did to Ukraine. The very fact that Russia isn't in smoldering ruins today illustrates the fact that NATO is not a threat to Russia, even when Russia goes into Ukraine. So, I think the world is going to see Russia and its geopolitical intentions and actions for what they are very clearly, and it's going to see how vacuous and empty and disingenuous pretty much all of the Russian arguments are for this conflict as this all unfolds. But let's also note the reason that NATO is not a threat to Russia is because Russia has the most modern and advanced and expansive nuclear arsenal in the world today, slightly edging us. And that's why we don't have a military conflict between Russia and NATO or Russia and the United States over this issue. Very simple, nuclear deterrence. Russia has a credible nuclear arsenal that is massive and that is modernized. And this was never going to result in a war because of that fact. That's why NATO is not a threat to Russia. And that's why their entire argumentation ultimately collapses. So let me just conclude by saying, I think we really are at an inflection point in a lot of different ways. What is China going to do? For its part, that's a serious inflection point for the world, for the global economy, for China itself, for the U.S. China relationship. What does China really want as a nation? And what choices will get it to that goal? These are the things I think the Chinese leadership are now very deeply thinking about. And they have implications for the United States and for the world. Obviously, the Russia-Ukraine situation, what's going to happen with that is an entirely different topic and one that is going to play out over the weeks and months ahead. What does the end game look like? What does the end state look like? What does Ukraine look like 6 months from now or a year from now? I won't even speculate on that for purposes now, except to say that there's a whole series of very open questions around that. But I think that fundamentally and in conclusion, we really are at a tipping point moment in the world, the likes of which we have not seen in a long, long time, where the world really could go a couple of different ways. And a lot of it hinges on whether China lends its heft and its credibility as a nation, such as it is, to the Russian side of the Cold War, to the US and allied side of the Cold War, or to some sort of a straddling neutral position. That's probably the central question in international affairs today. And it's certainly one that we're paying a lot of attention to at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. And this issue, the issue of Russia, Ukraine, and China's role and the impact on U.S. China relations is one that's very front and center for all of us. What we're trying to do at the foundation is to keep open channels of communication between the United States and China, between officials, between former officials, between policy experts, between academics, think tank experts, other private citizens, business leaders, students. And I think never has there been a more urgent and pressing need for keeping those lines of communications open and for trying to get to a better place in the relationship and for the world. With that, I'll conclude. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to speak to this topic. And I look forward to hearing your questions and comments for the remaining 27 minutes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David. I will tell our attendees we think we would prefer you use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. We already have some coming in, but one question that has come in is, how will Putin's security or vulnerability as leader be impacted by the Ukraine episode?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do see it there, and I'll certainly go into the Q&A section here, and John or I can go through and respond to each of these questions, pull them up and respond. To this question, I think it is an open question as to whether the sentiment in Russia about the impact of Vladimir Putin's decision to go into Ukraine, the impact of that decision on Russia, on the Russian economy, on average Russian people, for that matter, on the Russian elites or the so-called oligarchs and people around them. Is there enough pain there? Have we reached a sufficient pain point, if you will, to actually start to generate the potential for some of these players to take matters into their own hands, to try to stage a coup, to try to oust Putin from power, to try to essentially end what some in Russia, I think, regard as a catastrophic policy choice, this war of choice in Ukraine. I don't think that we are at that threshold. It's certainly a legitimate question. It's certainly a plausible question to ask, but I don't think we can underestimate the degree to which Putin has insulated himself from a security standpoint from these kinds of internal threats. He has the intelligence community seemingly firmly in his camp. He has the other power players in the Russian government, the so-called power ministries or siloviki, to use the Russian slang term, basically the power players in the security ministries, the defense ministry, and so on, essentially seemingly on his side. I think the likelihood from where I sit that we're going to see kind of a coup d'etat type scenario or the ousting of Putin, in this type of an action, I think the likelihood of that is low. It's not perhaps impossible, but I think his hold on power in Russia is very, very tight. He's also, as I think many of you may know, criminalized essentially free speech and free media. There were some media outlets in Russia up until about a month ago or 3 weeks ago that actually could report the truth. There weren't many of them, but there were a few. I knew a lot of those journalists myself personally. And now every major independent media organization has been muzzled, and a law has gone on the books that levies a 15-year prison term for anyone that quote unquote reports inaccurately about the war in Ukraine or quote unquote spreads disinformation, which in many cases means tells the truth. And so, the muzzle is there, and the ability of Russians to organize laterally to kind of create the kind of movement that it might take to generate a change in Russian leadership. I don't see it being there, and I think we're going to be dealing with Putin for quite a long time to come. But the speculation is certainly there, and depending on how much pain is generated from these sanctions and where that pain hits the Russian economy, and how long this lasts, we might, need to revisit the answer to that question in a few weeks or a few months, but I don't see it for right now.
Regarding the timing, to what extent did change in leadership in Germany, along with Biden leading the U.S., lead Putin to believe in weakness in NATO cohesiveness and willingness to act?
I think that's a very good question, and I think it would seem to be the case that that Putin perhaps or presumably felt that NATO would not respond, or that the West generally, that is the US, NATO, Europe, much of Europe is not in NATO, including Western democracies such as Sweden, Finland, and Switzerland, and others, that perhaps Putin thought that there would be more debate or less cohesiveness or unity around the Western response. If that is what his judgment was, obviously he was wrong. I would not have assumed that myself. I do hear a lot of Americans and others saying that they were surprised at the degree to which NATO responded in unity to this. I'm not surprised by it. This is an egregious act. But it is evident that one plausible theory is that Putin simply either got bad intelligence or made a poor judgment, an inaccurate judgment as to the degree to which NATO would respond in a forceful way. I don't know whether the German political transition or German political considerations played into it. I don't suspect that just my gut tells me. I don't suspect that would have been a major consideration, but I do think the notion of Biden, the notion of a U.S. response, perhaps the notion that Biden is not, in Putin's mind, is not a strong leader, or is an elderly leader that may not have the fire in the belly to take on this kind of issue, or that NATO was, not unified around this. Those kinds of considerations, I think, are plausible to me as considerations that might have been in Putin's mind. If so, obviously he misjudged the situation very badly. But I do think, going back to a point that I made earlier, that the political impact of this on Biden and the potential political impact of this move on the U.S. Midterms and on the U.S. 2024 presidential race may also have been a consideration. I don't think it's an accident that we didn't see this happen when Donald Trump was president. And I don't think it's an accident that we saw this happen on Biden's watch. And it may very well have been an attempt by Putin to give Biden a black eye and to lend impetus for a restoration of Donald Trump as the next president of the United States. I think all those considerations are in the mix.
The next question is, what impact do you think the sanctions will have on Russia and on Putin's ongoing calculus?
That's a great question. In the short run, meaning over the next several weeks or months, I don't think the sanctions are going to have any impact at all on what Putin does. I don't think he cares, quite frankly. Look, he's fabulously wealthy. He lives in opulent circumstances. He's fine. His family is fine. The people that are important to him are fine. I don't honestly think he cares about the people of Russia. If he did, I think he would have done a better job leading them over the last 22 or 23 years. I've often pointed out that never has a leader with more power used that power to so little of a degree to help his people. It's really a striking vector or gap between the amount of power that Putin has constitutionally as president of the Russian Federation and what he's done with that power to actually better the circumstances of the people of his nation. One would have a hard time finding another precedent in history. There would be a few, but this would be right up there among cases in which a leader that had a lot of power to potentially do good did nothing with it. So I don't think President Putin cares about the impact of these sanctions on his country or on the average people in Russia. If anything, he may be banking on the notion that when the Russian people feel the pinch of these sanctions, that they will, if anything, flock to him in greater numbers and support him in greater numbers and kind of unify against the foreign baddies, if you will, the United States, NATO, the West, and so on. But in the immediate term, will these sanctions put enough pressure or pain on Putin, on the country, or on the people of Russia so as to generate political pressure, a sufficient level of political pressure on Vladimir Putin to change his policies? No, absolutely not. I don't see it, not for weeks, not for months, and maybe not for years. But, we'll see over time how much damage is done and how the Russian people themselves react to that. And that'll be a question for the Russian people to decide. But one thing that I think is worth pointing out is that about 2 weeks ago, data came out that indicated, authoritative public opinion data, that indicated that 58% of Russians support Putin's war in Ukraine. And whether that number is exactly accurate, whether it may overstate the number by a few percentage points, one can debate. But the methodology was sound, and this was Russians polling Russians, as I understand it. And what you have is a pretty significant majority of Russians supporting this effort. So it's going to be a long time before the sanctions have any perceptible impact, if ever they do at all, on Vladimir Putin's actions.
Next question is there any conceivable gain for Russia as a result of the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, in truth, I honestly, genuinely don't see one. It's, to me, it's a head scratcher. I don't see what Russia gets out of this. I don't see that they're made more secure. In fact, I think they're made considerably less secure. I don't see that Russia's economy does any better, because obviously it's going to do an awful lot worse because of the sanctions and the removal from the SWIFT banking system and all the myriad things that are happening. All of that's going to be horrible. the loss of markets for its oil and resources and exports such as they are. Um, hardship borne by the Russian people. It's certainly a people that is not unaccustomed to hardship. God bless the people of Russia for what they've been through over the last 100 years or so. But the level of hardship is going to increase. I just don't see any real upside at all. I don't think that, neutralizing or Finlandizing the Ukraine is going to help Russian security in any appreciable way, for the simple reason that the main guarantor of Russian security is Russia's vast modernized nuclear arsenal. It's why NATO is not fighting Russia today. It's why Russia is not in smoldering ruins today. It's because it has this nuclear arsenal. And it's never going to be in smoldering ruins because nobody is ever going to attack Russia, because Russia has the ability to incinerate any country that would ever dream of doing that and incinerate the world itself. So, the notion that somehow, having sub-region A or sub-region B of Ukraine as, quote, independent states, I'm talking about Donetsk and Lugansk, or, the notion of Crimea, or the notion of, Russian, taking of Ukrainian land and other parts of the country, that somehow enhances Russia from a security standpoint. It's just ludicrous. It doesn't make any sense. So the short answer, no. I don't see any upside to this. I cannot, for the life of me, truly understand why this would have been a rational thing to do, even from Russia's standpoint. I'm trying to understand. I don't get it. I don't understand it. And I think this will go down as one of the most colossal strategic mistakes ever made by a leader in the history of the world. Maybe not the most, but one of the most colossal misjudgments, mistakes, and absolutely idiotic decisions in every single respect.
Much of Russia's war machine is out of date and poorly supplied. So if Russia is the premier nuclear power, are they therefore more likely to use nukes because that has been their focus?
It's a really good question, because one thing we have seen is that the Russian conventional military forces, the tanks, the armored divisions, the soldiers and so on, honestly, they haven't seemingly done a very good job. I mean, they haven't subjugated yet a much weaker, much smaller country that really wasn't ready for this, wasn't prepared for it. They didn't do anything to spark this. And out of the blue, Russia crosses tanks over the sovereign boundary line and goes in. And 5 weeks later, they're still bogged down. You see all kinds of casualties on the Russian side. You see all kinds of tanks and heavy armor strewn along the sides of the road. All kinds of problems with resupply, logistics. There have been radio intercepts where you can literally listen online in the original Russian with translation to what one commander is saying to another about how they have no supplies, they have no backup. You sometimes hear Russians sobbing to each other because they're in a vulnerable position. They have no help. So the performance, according to military experts, and I don't profess to be a military expert per se. I've studied Russia, but I'm not a hardware expert, et cetera. But the military experts on the U.S. side, 4-star generals, 3-star generals, and others have said Russia is doing horribly. So to the question, does that mean that it's more likely that Russia would use nuclear weapons? Not necessarily, but it is certainly true that Vladimir Putin has rattled the nuclear saber by saying, look, we have these weapons and we will use them if we have to. I think what he means is if NATO comes in and fights on the side of Ukraine and fights Russia, that Russia reserves the right to go nuclear and to use its nuclear weaponry, which is the one thing that it has that does indeed deter any nation from ever attacking Russia. There's no question about it. Again, it's why NATO doesn't attack Russia today, nor will it. I think that my reading of Russia is that you know, Russia is not afraid to rattle that saber and to reference its arsenal as it has. Vladimir Putin has referenced its arsenal very specifically and in a kind of a menacing way. Do I think that Russia will use a nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon in the Ukrainian theater? I don't. I don't think Russia will do that. But again, Russia has surprised me at times in my many years of observing the country. But no, I don't anticipate that Russia would use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. I don't think it has to do that to achieve its objectives. And I don't think it will do it. But I don't doubt, candidly, and there's a debate, I think, around this with some who would agree with me and others who may not. I think probably more would agree with my position. I don't doubt that Vladimir Putin could use a nuclear weapon if we were in a serious Russia-NATO conflict. That would be a different story. But short of that, I don't see it happening. And I think while Putin must be pretty dissatisfied and reportedly is dissatisfied, according to reports, with what he has seen from his conventional military forces on the battlefield so far, that being said, I don't anticipate that he will resort to other means. I think he's just going to keep plodding away and muddling through until he achieves whatever it is his objective is. And that's a separate discussion. What he wants to see at the end of this, I think, is really a question mark. And we can talk about that as well. But I don't think we're going to see a resort to nuclear weapons in the Ukrainian theater.
What about the effect on the Russian public of military casualties?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, there's no question now that Russia, the Russian public, and I'm in touch with some of my very good friends in Russia even now, via different means, and I don't think there's any question that most Russians are not getting an accurate picture of what's happening in Ukraine. And while there probably is some awareness that there have been some casualties, and there have been, obviously, on the Russian side, as well as obviously many casualties on the Ukrainian military and civilian sides. Still, overall, I don't think we're seeing fact-based reporting that's telling the whole truth of what's happening, getting through to most Russian people. So, I don't think we're anywhere near a kind of Vietnam or Afghanistan point in terms of this notion of parents seeing the body bags, if you will, coming back, and that having an impact on public sentiment in terms of the level of support for the war. That is not something that I perceive as happening right now. And I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon because of the strictures that have been placed on the Russian media, the muzzling that has occurred. Independent journalism is off the air. It's gone. A lot of these journalists have now been sent to prison and through sham trials. The only thing that most Russians are hearing for the most part is the party line, if you will, the Putin line about what's happening and the notion of, quote, denazifying, this ludicrous and sick notion of the so-called denazification of Ukraine and all this other garbage that they're being fed. And so I don't think we're seeing any real impact in terms of, quote, the body bags, unquote, coming back. But again, the longer this drags on and the more body bags there are and the more lives in Russia that are tragically affected by the loss of life of loved ones who went to fight a war that they probably didn't want to fight or didn't even know they were going to be fighting. Over time, that may take a toll on public sentiment, but I think we're a long, long way from that happening.
What role does Turkey play?
One thing I do know is that the most recent round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine took place in Turkey under the good offices of that nation. I don't think the talks have really led anywhere, and press reports state that in the wake of those talks, Russia has escalated its bombing of certain parts of Ukraine. but that being said, it seems clear that Turkey seems to be one of the places that has kind of offered up its good offices as a venue for negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to get to a negotiated settlement. And even then, the notion that it's fairly negotiated is obviously um, not. That's obviously not the case because Russia is in the country slaughtering people, and it's under that duress that Ukraine is even negotiating with Russia to begin with. But anyway, Turkey is apparently one of those places that is seen as a trusted venue within which discussions can occur. Beyond that, I'm not very familiar with any more specific a role that Turkey is playing in this particular context.
Assuming Russia wins this war, can they win a peace in Ukraine?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think the answer to the question is it's hard to imagine that Russia is going to be able to kind of subjugate and pacify the 40 some million residents of Ukraine, at least those that have remained in Ukraine. And again, millions have left. 11, 12, 13 million have been displaced, at least internally, and in some cases externally of the country. But tens of millions are there, and their sense of national unity and sense of national identity and sense of resolve, I think, has been galvanized beyond anyone's imagination as a result of this barbaric military action against their nation, absolutely unprovoked and absolutely unjustified. And I think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for Russia to, in a sense, pacify Ukraine and simply do to Ukraine as a whole what it has in fact done to Crimea, and just kind of annex it in a kind of bloodless way, or annex it and have it be accepted. I don't see it. I think there's always going to be pockets of resistance. And the Ukrainian people are a very proud people. They do have a very special sense and unique sense of national identity. And I just don't think that you're going to get to a point where this is simply accepted. And yes, there may be terms negotiated as to whether Ukraine foregoes the right to join NATO and so forth and so on. Those things probably can and will be negotiated. But the notion that, will Russia get to a place where it, quote, wins the peace and gets Ukraine to, be a kind of docile vassal state, I don't see it. And I think if Russia is thinking in those terms, it's got another thing coming.
What about the
What is
NATO
the role
countries?
and impact of the Russian Orthodox Church in this tragedy?
Well, from what I've seen so far, and by the way, all these are great questions, and I really appreciate people asking them. From what I've seen so far, my impression is that the Russian Orthodox Church, which has been a strong ally of President Putin from the very beginning, seems to be supportive of this war. I think I've seen imagery where the patriarch of the church has, kind of blessed President Putin's actions and kind of lent the good housekeeping seal of approval of the church to the Putin presidency and to Putin's decision about Ukraine. If I'm not mistaken, that's what I've seen. And I don't think the church is going to have any role in this other than one of a posture of supportiveness toward President Putin, who has long been a kind of ally. And there's no scenario, in my judgment, where the church ends up becoming a significant force for a kind of protest movement or something of that nature. On the contrary, Putin and the church are very much arm in arm in the way they work together and in seemingly what they want for Russia. And I don't see the church playing any role other than one of coming at it from a position of supportiveness of Vladimir Putin.
I must admit that answer surprised me. I think that does it. We are really at the limit of our time, and I thank you very much on behalf of the Faculty Emeriti Association for taking the time and for giving us this insight into the events. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks so much to everybody. Really appreciate it. Look forward to having a chance to be with you again in the future. Thank you
We
very
hope
much.
so.
Thank you.